The telegram hit Washington like a punch to the ribs. British metallurgists classify the alloy as unforgivable, recommending termination of project. Unforgivable. The word echoed through every corridor, every lab, every drafting room where America's engineers were already drowning in wartime pressure. Factories were burning through money. Materials were vanishing. Time was bleeding out fast. But this was different. This wasn't a setback. This was a death sentence for the machine they hadn't even built yet. The B-29, America's final, desperate swing at ending the war needed an engine bigger than anything humans had ever tried to tame. 18 cylinders, 4 rows, more horsepower than the law of physics was willing to allow. But that monster demanded one thing, a crankcase forged from a metal no one on Earth had ever successfully shaped. So when the British, the world's most experienced metallurgists, said it was impossible, America suddenly understood something. They weren't just building a bomber. They were trying to bend the universe. Kansas. 1942. Heat roared like a hungry animal inside. The foundry waves of fire rolling off the furnace as if some ancient forge god lived in there and hated everyone. Sparks shot through the air in violent bursts. Men in leather aprons moved like ghosts through smoke so thick it tasted metallic. At the center of the chaos stood a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Arthur Hawley, lead metallurgist, 39 years old, widowed, driven. He held the telegram in his soot-blackened hand, reading it for the 20th time. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. Around him, his crew waited silently, staring at him through fogged-up goggles. They'd heard the news, too. They knew why the air suddenly felt heavier. Hawley finally crumpled the paper and tossed it into the furnace. The flame swallowed it instantly. British say this alloy can't be forged, one of the younger workers said quietly. Hawley didn't look at him. That's why we're gonna forge it. He replied, Sir, we've tried 6 times. Every mold cracked. The metal tears itself apart. Hawley picked up a long steel rod and pointed it toward the glowing furnace. That metal is like a wild animal, he said. And wild animals don't obey orders. He turned to the crew. So we don't force it. We study it. We feel how it breathes. We watch how it bends. We let it show us what it wants. The men stared. This wasn't engineering. This was something else. Something closer to religion. They began again. Molten alloy thick like lava poured from the crucible, splashing sparks across the floor. The smell of burning flux and hot steel filled the room. Hawley stood inches from the heat, face illuminated orange, sweat rolling down his jaw, temperature holding at 2400. A worker called out. Not enough, Hawley said. Bring it to 26. That'll blow the lining. Do it. The furnace roared louder as if offended. Flames twisted upward like they were trying to escape. Every man in the room felt the pressure, physical and emotional, as if the heat was crawling under their skin. Because they all knew the truth. If they failed tonight, the program would be shut down, and without this engine, thousands of American boys wouldn't make it home. At 2:17 a.m., they tried the pour. The molten mass flowed into the mold bright enough to turn the whole foundry white. The men held their breath. The metal hissed, groaned, shifted. For a moment, just one, everyone believed this might finally be the one. Then, crack! The sound tore through the room like a gunshot. A fracture split the mold open. Liquid metal spilled across the floor, exploding into sparks. Men cursed and jumped back. Someone threw sand. Someone else screamed. Hawley didn't move. He just stared at the broken mold, jaw clenched, hands shaking, not with fear, with fury. He turned slowly to his crew. No one leaves, he said. Not until we understand why it failed. But Sir, sunrise is in 3 hours. I don't give a damn if the sun never rises, Hollis snapped. We solved this. 2 hours passed. The furnace kept burning. Coffee went cold. Men collapsed onto crates, exhausted, but Halle kept moving chalk in hand, drawing diagrams on the concrete floor like a madman. Pressure curves, cooling rates, stress fractures, thermal gradients, dot lines everywhere. Numbers everywhere. His brain was a war zone. Then Halle froze. A thought hit him so hard he dropped the chalk dot slow. Cooling. He'd been doing it wrong. Everyone up, he said. His voice cracked with excitement. I know what we missed. The men groaned but obeyed. They'd follow him anywhere now through fire or hell because the madness in his eyes looked like genius. Halle approached the furnace. We're not forging a part, he said quietly. We're forging a heartbeat. The crew exchanged confused looks. Halle touched the mold gently, almost reverently. Engines don't live because we force them to, he whispered. They live because we understand what makes them die. He looked up. And tonight, this thing is going to live. They prepared the next attempt. This time, the mold was reshaped, the cooling channels redirected, the alloy mixture adjusted by 0.5%, the pour angle changed by 6 degrees, and the cooling rate slowed dramatically. Every tweak mattered. Every second mattered. At 4:42 a.m., they tried again. The pour was smooth. The metal flowed perfectly. Halle stood still, fists clenched, watching for the first sign of failure. Seconds passed, then a minute, then 2. No cracks. No fractures. No sound. Just stillness. The men held their breath. Halle stepped closer. He touched the mold. He closed his eyes, and he smiled. Boys, he whispered, we just made history.
If you believe that ordinary people can shape history, even when no one remembers their names, write 7 in the comments right now. If you think history only belongs to those in the headlines, hit the like button. And if stories like this move you, stories of courage hidden behind silence, subscribe because this channel exists to keep their voices alive, one forgotten hero at a time.
The foundry fell silent, not because the men were tired though. They were beyond exhaustion, but because for the first time in weeks, the mold didn't scream, crack, or explode. It just sat there, cooling like a sleeping giant wrapped in stone. Few of the younger workers looked at each other as if afraid to breathe too loud. Superstition ran thick in these workshops. Nobody wanted to jinx a miracle, but Arthur Halle didn't believe in superstition. He believed in patterns. He believed in heat curves, metal memory, tensile stress, the language of alloys. And right now, everything inside him said, this one might live. He exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the mold, chest rising and falling like he was standing in front of a newborn child. Let it cool, he whispered. No sudden moves. No rush. Let it breathe. The men nodded silently, because they all understood something unspoken. If this crankcase survives the next few hours, America's impossible engine might finally have a heartbeat. By sunrise, the mold had cooled enough to handle. Steel boots scraped across the floor as the men positioned winches and chains overhead. The entire foundry seemed to hold its breath as they lifted the shell. A crackle. A groan. A few flakes of burnt sand fell away. Then, clunk, the mold split open. A blast of heat rushed out like the last sigh of a dying dragon. Inside lay the casting, dense, massive, smooth, unbroken. Single piece of forged alloy that looked like it had been carved from the center of a meteor. It's whole, someone whispered. Halle didn't speak. He reached out a shaking hand, brushed away residue, and his fingers touched metal that felt alive. Not alive like an animal. Alive like a machine with a destiny. He inhaled sharply. This, Halle whispered, voice trembling. This will be the heart of the B-29. The crew let out a breath they had been holding for weeks. Some sat down. Some laughed. One man covered his face and cried because he had lost his brother in the Pacific, and this engine might end the war faster. Hale wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Not even close. He turned to his assistant, Morgan. Get the machinists. We need to start trimming this before the alloy memory shifts. Morgan frowned. You want to machine it now? We just pulled it out. If the grain structure twists while cooling, we'll lose the whole thing, Hale said. No chances. Morgan nodded and ran. Within minutes, machinists rolled in with carbide cutters and calibrated rigs. The massive casting was slowly lowered onto the cutting bench. As the first tool touched the metal, sparks burst outward in a waterfall of gold and white. Hale stared intensely. Easy. Don't force it. Let the metal tell you how fast it wants to go. The machinist adjusted speed, grinding rhythmically. A small piece shaved away. Then another. Then another. Smooth? Controlled? Perfect. Morgan whistled. This thing machines cleaner than anything we've cast before. Hale nodded. Eyes narrowed. That's because it didn't fight us this time. He said it softly. But every man around him felt the weight of those words. This engine had been at war with them since day one. Tonight, it finally surrendered. Maybe hours later, as the sun rose higher, a jeep screeched to a halt outside the foundry. A man in uniform jumped out, Washington insignia on his shoulder. Urgency in his stride. He stormed through the doors. Where is Hale? He barked. Hale stepped forward, arms crossed, sweat-soaked shirt clinging to him. What's the problem now? Hale asked. The officer held up a sealed folder. This isn't a problem, he said. This is an order, Hale frowned. An order for what? The officer stepped closer. Washington wants 20 of these crankcases forged by the end of the month. Silence crashed over the foundry like an anvil. One of the workers choked on his coffee. Another swore under his breath. Morgan stared in disbelief. 20? Morgan shouted. Sir, this took us 6 weeks. We just cracked the process hours ago. The officer didn't blink. I'm not here to debate. I'm here to inform. Hale stepped forward, eyes dark. You want 20 of these now? The officer nodded. This engine is the only one capable of lifting the payload needed to end this war. Washington believes slow manufacturing will cost thousands of lives. Hale clenched his teeth. And if we fail? The officer looked him dead in the eyes. Then the B-29 program collapses. The room went silent. A distant hammer dropped. Someone whispered a prayer. The officer handed Hale the folder. As of this morning, your foundry has been designated a priority national asset. You will have more workers, more resources, more raw metal. Whatever you ask for. Hale didn't open the folder. He didn't need to. He already knew the truth. The impossible wasn't done. It had just begun. He looked over at the still glowing crankcase. At the exhausted crew. At the fire that hadn't stopped burning for days. Then he lifted his chin. Get the furnaces running, Hale said softly. Morgan stared at him. You're not serious. Hale stepped closer. Fire reflecting in his eyes. We don't have time to be tired. The officer nodded once. That's the spirit Washington is counting on. Hale didn't look at him. He looked at his men. Boys, he said. We're about to forge 20 hearts for the biggest bird ever built. And every single one has to live. He placed a hand on the casting. This metal listens now. Let's teach it how to fly. The furnaces didn't cool for the next 40 hours. Not once. Not even for a breath. More workers arrived from Wichita, Chicago, St. Louis young, old, exhausted, terrified, desperate. Some had been pulled straight off assembly lines. Others were welders drafted from shipyards. A few were farmhands who barely knew how to hold a hammer, but were told, if you can lift metal, you can help win the war. The foundry floor transformed into something no American factory had seen before. A war zone made of steel. Molten metal roared like a volcano. Cranes swung overhead in violent arcs. Sparks rained like fireworks. Workers shouted over the noise orders, warnings, prayers. And in the center stood Arthur Hall, clothes soaked with sweat, fingers burned from grabbing hot tools, eyes red, sleepless, unblinking. Living on stale coffee and pure willpower, Washington wanted 20 CRNKCAs. Halle wanted 20 miracles. By day 3, exhaustion was brutal. Men slept standing up. Some fainted on the floor. A few walked into walls because their vision blurred from heat and smoke. Morgan tried to force Halle to rest. You haven't slept. Your hands are shaking. You're gonna collapse. Halle stared at the glowing furnace. I'll rest when the war does. That's not how war works, Morgan muttered. No, Halle replied, voice low, but it's how engines work. Morgan frowned. What does that even mean? Halle pointed at the swirling molten alloy behind the furnace door. Engines don't care how tired you are. They don't care how much pressure you're under. They don't care about Washington, Japan, the Pacific, or anything else. He wiped sweat from his brow. They only obey one thing, the people who refuse to quit on them. Morgan shook his head, knowing nothing would stop him. The second crankcase failed, not violently, not dramatically. It died quietly, a hairline fracture, running along the cooling curve like a scar across bone. Haller ran his thumb over the crack, jaw tight. Cool too fast, he whispered. Morgan cursed. Sir, the mold design is identical to the first one. No two pores are identical, Halle snapped. Not with this alloy. He stood up, pacing. Slow the cooling channels. Increase the feed pressure. Adjust the fin geometry just slightly. Morgan blinked. You're changing the mold. Per casting? Yes, that's insane. Halle turned to him. That's why this metal listens to me and not them. It wasn't arrogance. It was obsession. The good kind. The dangerous kind. Day 5. The foundry smelled of oil, sweat, and burnt steel. Workers had bags under their eyes the size of bruises. Hands trembled from fatigue. Voices cracked from shouting over the roar of flame, but the third crankcase survived. Barely. 4 microfractures. 2 internal voids. One wall a fraction too thin. Morgan muttered, this won't fly. Halle shook his head. It doesn't have to fly. It has to teach us. He threw a chalk circle around one flaw. This void is telling us our pour rate is unstable. He circled another. And this fracture wants wider cooling ribs. He placed a hand on the casting like a doctor examining a patient's heartbeat. This engine talks, Halle murmured. We just need to listen faster. Washington wouldn't wait. Neither would the war. Day 7. The foundry took on a life of its own. The machine screamed. The furnace throbbed. The workers moved like shadows. Everything blurred into one continuous loop of heat, grind, pour, cool, cut, measure. Adjust. It didn't feel like building engines anymore. It felt like trying to tame a living beast. And slowly, painfully, they were learning how it breathed. At 3:19 a.m. A telegram came from Washington. Japanese forces advancing in the Pacific. B-29 deployment timeline accelerated. Status required immediately. Morgan looked at Halle. What should I tell them? Halle kept working, not looking up. Tell them we're forging the heart that's gonna end this damn war. The fourth crankcase lived. The fifth lived. 6 showed only minor imperfections. 7th was nearly perfect. So perfect that the machinist stopped talking mid-cut and stared at Halle like he had pulled lightning out of the sky. Sir, Morgan whispered, awe in his voice. "This one's flawless." Hawley just nodded. "It's learning," he said softly. "And so are we?" But the pressure didn't stop. Washington sent inspectors, colonels, engineers, advisors, all asking the same question. "Can you produce 20 in time?" Hawley ignored them all. Instead, he stared at the row of completed crankcases, massive metal hearts lined up like soldiers ready to march. "Each one hears the war," he said quietly. "They know their purpose." The inspector frowned. "Engines don't know anything." Hawley turned slowly. "You build airplanes with numbers," he said. "We build engines with scars." The inspector didn't understand, but the workers did. By the end of week 2, 12 crankcases stood ready. 12 forged hearts, 12 chances at victory. But Washington wouldn't celebrate yet. Not until they heard one question answered: will they run? And that question wasn't for Washington to decide. Not for the inspectors. Not for Morgan. Not even for Hawley. It was the engines themselves. Because now came the moment every man in the foundry had been dreading. The first full-power ignition test. If it passed, America had its miracle. If it failed, everything burned. Hawley stared at the massive engine mounted on the test stand, 18 cylinders. Chrome manifolds, supercharger assembly, ignition lines like veins. The workers gathered behind him. Silent. Hawley inhaled deeply. "Gentlemen," he said, "let's wake the giant." Morgan flipped the ignition. The starter motor whined. The pistons twitched. The engine coughed once. A low, beast-like growl. Then the entire building shook. ROOOOA-A. Sound like thunder tearing itself apart. The floor vibrated. Dust rained from the ceiling. Men covered their ears as the engine screamed with a voice that wasn't mechanical anymore. It sounded alive. Hawley grinned. Morgan shouted over the noise, "Sir, it's holding." Cylinder tongue air, suddenly a loud metallic clang followed by a violent shudder. The engine roared again, too loud, too deep, too angry. Something was wrong, very wrong. Hale's smile faded. "Shut it down," he shouted. "We can't, the pressure's spiking." The engine began to glow red, and then it happened. The engine didn't explode. It fought. A deep, violent shudder ripped through the East Hartford test bay, not the sound of total failure. Not the sound of metal dying, but the sound of a machine pushed past the limits of anything human hands had ever built. A burst of flame shot from the exhaust stacks. The gauges slammed into the red. The entire concrete cell trembled as if the ground itself were rejecting the power inside it. "Cut the mixture!" Someone shouted behind the glass. "We did." An engineer barked. "It's still pulling air through the turbo." Brackett moved closer to the test window, ignoring the heat bleeding through the reinforced glass. His jaw tightened. The pistons weren't seizing. The bearings weren't collapsing. Something else was happening, something he had warned them about 100 times. Uneven expansion. The inner rows of cylinders, the ones that always baked hotter, were swelling faster than the outer rings. The crankshaft was trying to twist out of alignment. The engine was wrestling with itself. "Shut her down!" Brackett shouted. "We can't. Turbine pressure's climbing, she won't bleed off." The R4360 roared again. Not like a predator. Not like a beast. Like a factory full of hammers swinging at once. The propeller disc shimmered just on the edge of losing balance. Bolts rattled loose. The vibration gauges scribbled black chaos. The supercharger housing began to glow. "Brace!" a mechanic yelled. Then, boom humph, a deep, concussive thud rolled through the entire building. Dust fell from the rafters. The lights flickered. A sheet of black smoke burst out of the exhaust tunnels. Cylinder detonation. Someone yelled. We lost one of the inner row heads, but Brackett leaned forward, squinting through the haze. No, he said slowly. That wasn't a failure. That was the detonation ring relieving pressure. The smoke began to thin. The roaring settled. The gauges steadied. The engine, this massive, four-row monster, kept running. Rough at first, then smoother, then almost calm, like it had found its equilibrium again. One of the younger engineers stared in disbelief. It survived that, sir? We should be picking pieces of it off the walls. Brackett placed a hand on the trembling test console. It stabilized at high thermal load, he said quietly. The new alloy held. The impeller kept airflow even enough to save the inner cylinders. The room went silent. For the first time in months, they weren't staring at a corpse. They were staring at a living engine. Morgan swallowed hard. Sir, is that even possible? Brackett finally allowed himself a breath. It means, he said, that this design can survive combat conditions. 10 seconds passed. Throttle down, Brackett ordered. Slow and steady. Morgan eased the lever. The engine responded immediately, obedient, controlled, powerful. As the RPM fell, so did the vibration. The thunder softened into a low growl. Then the piston slowed, and stopped. Clunk. Silence. The test crew stood frozen. Faces blackened with soot. Hands shaking. No one spoke. Finally, Morgan whispered, Sir, I think we just saw the R4360 pass its first crisis test. Brackett turned. No, he said softly. We saw proof that it can live. Washington arrived 15 hours later. A general, a colonel, 2 analysts, and a metallurgist from MIT. They clustered around the engine like surgeons around a patient who had defied the autopsy. The Métis man touched the warm crankcase. How did it survive thermal imbalance? He asked. Brackett answered without hesitation. We didn't avoid the heat. We designed for it. The colonel frowned. Meaning what? Brackett pointed at the 28-cylinder labyrinth of metal. This engine doesn't want gentle handling. It was built to run hot. Very hot. And the moment we treat it like every radial before it, we lose. He stepped back. This engine was designed for the Pacific. For altitude. For weight. For missions that kill lesser machines. The general looked at the engine, awe creeping into his voice. This is the engine that's going to reach Japan. Brackett nodded. And bring the boys home. Washington approved full-scale production that same night. The numbers were brutal. 40 engines. 0 defects. Non-stop deadlines. No excuses. Factories across the country shifted toward one purpose: feeding the monster that would power the B-29. And East Hartford became the heartbeat. Week after week, the engines came alive. Engine number 7 ran smoother than anything before it. Engine number 9 exceeded vibration expectations. Engine number 12 rattled the entire test bay. Engine number 14 triggered an emergency shutdown but lived. Engine number 18 finally produced the sound Brackett had been waiting for, a deep, confident thunder. He placed a hand on the warm crankcase. Gentlemen, he whispered, this is the sound of victory. But war doesn't wait. A telegram arrived. First B-29 squadron deploys immediately. Suddenly the engines weren't machines. They were lifelines. Brackett stood before the final assembled R4360, the metal still warm from test. Let's give them wings, he said. Because now, the real test wasn't in the foundry. It was in the sky. The morning of the first flight felt wrong from the start. Not because of the weather. The sky over Kansas was clear. A soft blue stretched across endless plains. Not because of the crew. Every one of them was trained. Steady, determined. Not because of the aircraft. The B-29 gleamed like a silver giant. Wings wide, engines polished, rivets shining in the sun. It felt wrong because everyone knew this. Once these engines leave the ground, there is no pause, no retry, no shutdown. If one of them failed up there, men would die. Brackett arrived before sunrise, boots clanking against the metal catwalk as he climbed up under the belly of the bomber. He placed a hand on the warm aluminum skin, almost like saying a prayer. Morgan stood beside him. "You don't look ready," he said quietly. Brackett exhaled. "I'm not." "No one is. The engine may live, Morgan. But can the plane survive it?" They stared at the four massive R-436OS mounted on the wings, four mechanical beasts, waiting to be unleashed. The test pilot arrived last. Captain Ira Dawson, 6'3", calm eyes. The kind of man who smiled before doing something insane. He slapped Brackett on the shoulder. "So you're the man who built the monster?" Brackett nodded. "You're the man crazy enough to fly it." Dawson grinned. "Best partnership the Air Corps ever made." The engines were primed. Fuel lines checked. Pressure gauges zeroed. Technicians scurried across the tarmac like ants, preparing a giant for battle. Then the moment came. Brackett placed his hand on the throttle. "Rail, start sequence," he said. The ground crew plugged in the starter carts. A high-pitched whine filled the air. Whirr-chug-chug. The first engine coughed, spat fire, and then ruo-a deep thunder shook the air. Dust rolled across the concrete. The propeller blurred into a circle of shimmering steel. One engine alive. Then the second. Then the third. The fourth nearly refused, gagged once. TWICE then roared awake like an insulted dragon. The entire bomber trembled under the combined fury. The ground crew stepped back instinctively. Brackett whispered, "If the world needed proof that America still fights, here it is." Dawson climbed into the cockpit, his co-pilot right behind him. Morgan leaned close to Brackett. "What if the detonation ring misbehaves again?" Brackett didn't look away from the engines. "Then we pray it holds. Or we pray Dawson can land a burning bomber without exploding." Morgan's face paled. The signal officer raised the green flag. Dawson rolled forward slowly, the engines growling in perfect sync. The B-29 lined up with the runway. Brackett felt his heartbeat sync with the prop rotation, an engineer's curse. Losing himself in rhythm, Dawson keyed the radio. "Tower, this is Test Flight Alpha. Clear for takeoff." The tower replied, "Alpha, you're clear. Good luck, and God help you." Dawson pushed the throttles. The engine screamed. The bomber lunged forward, slow at first, then faster, then dangerously fast. The wings flexed. The wheels juddered. Morgan shouted over the wind, "She's too heavy." Brackett didn't blink. "She lift." "How do you know?" "Because we built her to." And then, in a moment so smooth it almost felt unreal, the huge bomber lifted into the air. The wheels left the runway. The shadows separated from the ground. Four roaring monsters carried 50 tons of steel upward like it weighed nothing. Brackett felt his knees weaken. "It flies," he whispered. "It actually flies." But at 1,200 feet, the first warning light flashed. Supercharger temperature spike. Then another. Inner row cylinder temperature climbing beyond safety limits. Morgan froze. "Sir." The same pattern from the test bay. Brackett leaned over the radio. "Dawson, reduce mixture 30%. Feather airflow around the inner rings." Dawson's voice crackled back. Mixture adjusted. Tongue still climbing. Brackett swallowed hard. If the inner cylinders detonated up here, There would be no smoke-filled test cell, only sky, only fire, only a falling giant. Dawson, Brackett said. Ease throttle 4 degrees. Do it smooth. No sudden drops. Copy. The bomber banked slightly as Dawson executed the command. Morgan stared at the gauges. Tongue dropping? Dropping. Dropping stabilized. Brackett closed his eyes for a moment. A tiny moment. A stolen breath. Then the second warning light flashed. Oil pressure loss on engine 3. Morgan shouted. Brackett felt a cold shiver down his spine. Dawson, run emergency bypass. Don't kill the engine. Keep it alive. On it, bypass open. Pressure stabilizing. We're good. Brackett didn't celebrate because this wasn't luck. This was exactly what they built it for. The B-29 reached altitude. The engine settled into a deep, confident hum. Dawson's voice came through. Brackett, I've flown every engine the Air Corps ever built. He paused. But this one doesn't fly like a machine? Brackett leaned closer to the radio. How does it fly? It flies like a living thing. Like it knows what the mission is. Brackett smiled small, tired, proud. That's because everyone who built it did. The bomber circled the test field for 40 minutes. Then Dawson lined up for landing. The wheels touched down gentle, almost graceful. Like a giant deciding to sleep. As the engine spooled down, the thunder softened to a low purr. Then silence. The ground crew erupted in cheers. Morgan grabbed Brackett's shoulders. Sir, we did it. Brackett looked at the engine's 4 steel hearts still radiating heat. No, Morgan. This was just the first flight. He stepped forward, hand touching the warm crankcase of the closest engine. The real fight, he whispered, hasn't even begun yet. Because soon, these engines wouldn't be flying empty planes over Kansas. They'd be flying boys into the Fizz, into the Pacific. Into hell. And back. No one slept during the next 70 hours. Not the machinists. Not this. METALLURGISTS. Not the night shift welders who had been awake so long their hands moved with autopilot. Precision. And definitely not Brackett. Because now the redesign wasn't theory. It was reality. Steel, aluminum, sweat, and zero margin for error. Engine number 27 had survived the torture bench, but surviving wasn't enough. Not anymore. If these engines were going to the Pacific, they had to do more than live. They had to refuse to die. Brackett stood in front of the assembly platform, staring at the evolving shape of engine #28. Its ribs were thicker. Its cooling channels were reshaped sharper, smarter. The detonation ring housing had been widened by exactly 1.7 millimeters. Morgan examined the new crankshaft forging. This thing looks like it could bench press a train. Brackett didn't. Smile. It needs to. Morgan set the forging down gently. Sir, be honest. Do you think this redesign will hold? Brackett didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the half-completed engine and placed his hand on the casting warm from the night's pores. Even though dawn was barely touching the windows, it has to hold, he finally said. We're out of time, out of excuses, out of chances. Morgan breathed in slowly. Then let's finish it. By noon, engine number 28 was fully assembled. Shiny. Massive. A monster carved from flame and mathematics. Workers circled it, exhausted but hopeful. This wasn't just another prototype. This was the one. The engine that would either redeem the entire redesign or destroy it. Brackett stepped onto the test platform. Start. Sequence. The starter motors. WHINED. The pistons twitched. Oil pressure rose. Then dash ROOOOO IAAAR dash. The engine came alive with a bellow that rattled. Every window in the facility. Morgan shielded his face. Sounds like it wants to kill us. Brackett nodded. That means it's healthy. 5 minutes into the test, everything looked perfect. Cylinder stable. Supercharger airflow perfect. Oil. Temperature rising as predicted. No vibration anomalies. 10 minutes in, Morgan let out a tiny breath. Sir, maybe we finally... The gauges spiked. All of them. At once. Inner cylinder load. Plus 18% oil pressure. Drop supercharger turbine speed. Plus 600 RPM thermal gradient. Uneven. Dangerously uneven. Bracket's eyes widened. Double quotes. No. No. Shut it down. Morgan slammed the emergency lever. Nothing happened. The engine kept roaring hotter. Angrier, louder. A rivet shot from the cowling like a bullet, striking the wall. Workers ducked. A massive vibration rolled through the building. It's the inner ring again. Morgan yelled. Not this time. Brackett snapped. The wall is thicker, it should hold. But the engine didn't care. It was on the brink of tearing itself apart. Brackett ran to the manual cutoff valve, grabbed the wheel, and twisted with all his strength. His arm shook. Heat blasted his face. The metal burned his palms through the gloves. Morgan watched in horror. Sir, stop, you'll melt your dam. The valve turned. Fuel line sealed. The engine choked. Then, boom hoomfa. Violent pressure purge blasted through the exhaust stacks. Workers shielded their faces. Morgan stumbled backward. And then the roar dropped. The vibration eased. The engine stabilized. It lived. Barely. But it lived. 10 minutes later, the test cell was silent except for distant clanks and hissing metal cooling down. Morgan approached Brackett, who was sitting on a crate with his gloves charred and smoke rising from his sleeves. Sir, Morgan whispered, you almost lost your arm. Brackett stared at the engine. No, he said softly. I almost lost the redesign. Morgan sighed and sat beside him. So what happened? Brackett pointed weakly. Airflow cylinder pressure waveforms didn't equalize fast enough. The detonation ring relieved the load, just barely. If it were a millisecond slower. He didn't finish. Morgan looked at the cooling monster of metal. That wasn't a failure, he said. Brackett shook his head. Double quotes. No. It was a warning. That night, a storm rolled across Kansas. Thunder shook the foundry. Skylights. Lightning flashed across the assembly floor. Wind hammered the sheet metal walls. Inside, Brackett and the team worked through the storm, redesigning airflow channels again, this time more radical. Wider intake flares, sharper exhaust ports, a complete remachining of the inner baffles. Morgan stared. You're basically rewriting the engine's lungs. Brackett kept sketching. If it can't breathe without choking, it doesn't deserve to fly. Engine number 29 was next, and this one had to be perfect. The workers gathered as the engine was mounted onto the test stand. The storm outside cracked thunder through the walls. Brackett nodded. Start. The ignition lit. The engine roared to life. 5 minutes stable. 10 minutes clean. 15 no spikes. 20 temperatures. Perfect. Morgan leaned close. Sir, this is the smoothest one yet. Brackett didn't take his eyes off the gauges. Let's take it higher. Morgan swallowed. How high? Brackett's voice dropped. Combat load. Morgan hesitated. Sir, do it. Morgan pushed the throttle. The engine screamed, not in pain, not in struggle, but with a deep, furious confidence. The vibration stayed even. Temperatures held steady. SUPRCHARGER load normalized. Brackett felt his chest loosen. Then, for the first time since the redesign, he let out a breath. Morgan He whispered, "We built it." For the first time in weeks. The crew cheered. Some cried. Some hugged. Some simply stared at the engine with disbelief. Because after everything, the failures, explosions, redesigns, sleepless nights, close calls, they had forged a heart that could survive hell. 3 hours later, a telegram arrived. Field reports confirm B-29. Deployment accelerating. Engines must be combat certified immediately. Morgan looked at Brackett. "Sir, they're asking if we're ready." Brackett placed a hand on the crankcase of engine number 29. "We're ready," he said softly. "But now, we have to prove it. Because the next test wouldn't be in a factory. It would be in the sky. Above storm clouds. Above enemy fire. Above the vast, unforgiving Pacific. And that sky accepted only two kinds of machines. Those that failed, and those that lived long enough to bring boys home. The celebration didn't last 24 hours. By sunrise the next morning, a military courier jeep rolled into the Wichita test field carrying a sealed dispatch pouch. 2 MPs escorted it straight to Brackett's hangar office like they were delivering a bomb. Morgan watched from the workbench. "That doesn't look good," he muttered. Brackett sliced the envelope. Open. The message was short, cold, urgent. Engine field failure in Pacific Theater. B-29 down. Possible detonation ring collapse. Request immediate engineering investigation. Brackett read it twice. Then a third time. Morgan's face drained of color. "Sir, our engine?" "No," Brackett said quietly. "This wasn't ours. This was one of the early Wright radials." Morgan exhaled, but Brackett didn't, because one sentence burned deeper than all the others. Thermal load exceeded predicted. Envelope. The exact failure pattern that haunted every engineer who had ever touched a radial. Brackett folded the message. "Pack your bags," he said. "Where are we going?" Morgan asked. Brackett's eyes hardened. "Hawaii. They want us to look at the wreck." The flight to Pearl Harbor was long, silent, and thick with dread. From the air, the Pacific looked endless blue, deep, uncaring, a reminder that any sailing over this ocean was already a grave. They were driven straight from the airstrip to the wreckage site on Ford Island. The smell of burnt fuel still lingered in the air. Brackett stepped toward the mangled remains of the radial engine, a twisted nightmare of melted aluminum, split cylinders, and scorched steel. Morgan winced. "Sir, it looks like it lost a whole inner cylinder ring." "Not lost," Brackett said. "Vaporized." He knelt beside the engine, ran a hand across the warped crankcase. The metal felt wrong. Too soft, too brittle, like it died angry. One of the crew chiefs approached. Engine caught fire at altitude. Pilot tried to feather it. It wouldn't feather. The heat kept climbing. Then, he gestured at the wreck. "This," Brackett stared at the metal. "This wasn't a pilot mistake. This wasn't weather. This wasn't luck." He paused. "This was metallurgy. And metallurgy never lies." Hours later, as the sun set behind the hangars, Morgan sat next to Brackett on a fuel drum. "Sir, what are you thinking?" Brackett handed him a cracked cylinder head. "Look at the grain structure." Morgan squinted, then froze. "Sir, the aluminum collapsed inward." Brackett nodded. "Exactly. But how?" "Inner cylinders always run hot, sure, but this is fatigue accelerated by thin wall machining." Morgan's face twisted. "Too thin?" "Far too thin." They pushed for weight savings and paid for it with structural integrity. Morgan looked at the burning orange sky. "So this engine never had a chance." "No engine does," Brackett said softly, "if the people building it treat numbers like gospel." That night, In their temporary quarters, Morgan rubbed his eyes. "Sir, what does this mean for ours?" Brackett leaned forward. "It means the war is ending engines faster than we can build them. And if we don't do something right now, the B-29 program ends with it." "How?" Brackett stood. "With a redesign." Morgan blinked. "A redesign of which, T?" "Sir, our alloy barely survives the heat as is. What else can we possibly change?" Brackett grabbed the chalkboard and began sketching. "We're redesigning the airflow channels. We're thickening the inner walls by 2 millimeters. We're altering the rib geometry. We're adjusting the detonation ring clearance. We're reinforcing the thrust-bearing housing." Morgan stared. That's a complete internal overhaul." "Yes. With what time?" Brackett stepped closer, eyes burning with urgency. "Morgan, boys are dying out there. Engines are failing out there. Pilots are falling into the Pacific because we haven't given them machines that survive hell." He jabbed a finger at the chalkboard. "This overhaul isn't optional. It's oxygen." The next morning, Brackett stood before the Pacific Command Board. Generals, colonels, logistics officers. Men who had the power to shut the program down entirely. Brackett placed the warped cylinder head on the table. "This," he said, "is what happens when you build an engine for paper instead of war." The generals exchanged looks. Brackett continued. "Our design can survive these loads, but not without reinforcement. We need authorization to modify the production engineering immediately." The senior general leaned forward. "Redesign means delays. Delays mean fewer aircraft. Fewer aircraft mean dead crews." Brackett cut in. Silence. A long, tense silence. Then the general nodded slowly. "Approved." On the flight back to Wichita, Morgan stared out the window. "Sir, do you ever get tired of fighting the entire military?" Brackett shrugged. "I don't fight the military. I fight the clock. And the war." Morgan smiled faintly. "Sometimes. I think these engines scare you." Brackett looked at the clouds below. "They don't scare me," he said. Quietly. "They scare me when people trust them too." Much. Back at the foundry, the redesign consumed everything. Sparks flew nonstop. Blueprints piled up. Workers slept on benches. Parts arrived at midnight. Machinists cursed at complex new tolerances. Casting crews melted and poured until their hands shook. And through all of it, the engines kept evolving. Engine number 21 roared hotter but held its line. Engine number 22 stabilized at altitude simulation. Engine number 23 screamed like a banshee, cracked a rib, and nearly killed 2 operators. Engine number 24 refused to ignite. Engine number 25 ran for 3 full hours. Longer than any before it. Brackett watched every second, learning, adjusting, tuning the monster into something more than a machine. Something survivable. Something worthy. At midnight. Exhausted, covered in soot, Brackett ran a hand over the warm crankcase of engine number 27. "Morgan," he said softly. "We're close." "Close to what?" Morgan asked. Brackett smiled a tired, haunted smile. "To an engine that can fly into hell and come back home." The Pacific did not wait for them. Within 48 hours of engine number 29's success, Brackett and Morgan were ordered back to the test field, not for another ground run, not for another bench torture session, but for the one test that mattered more than all the others combined. Full combat load, high altitude, long-range endurance flight. No safety net, no emergency scaffolding, no insulated test bay, just sky. The sky that had killed dozens of bombers. The sky that had torn engines apart like tin cans. The sky that didn't care how many weeks of redesign they had survived. B-29 chosen for the trial was Silver Harvest. A plane so new the paint still smelled fresh. Its fuselage gleamed under the morning sun. The propeller blades had never turned at full power. The wings had never carried a bomber's burden. Inside the hangar, mechanics swarmed the aircraft like bees preparing a queen for war. Morgan held a clipboard, voice trembling slightly. Fuel load, full. Ammunition weight, simulating combat. Bomb bay, dummy ordnance. Crew, 5. Brackett nodded. Good. Today, we find out if our engine can face the enemy before the enemy ever shoots at it. Captain. Dawson walked in with his flight jacket thrown over his shoulder. You ready for round 2? He smirked. Brackett shook his head. This isn't round 2, Captain. This is the whole fight. Dawson winked. Then let's win it. At 8:14, the engines fired, one by one. They came alive. Engine number 1 clean ignition, engine number 2 stable airflow, engine number 3 perfect, thermal rise, engine number 4 deep. Confident roar. Morgan leaned close to Brackett. Sir, they sound better than the last test. Brackett stared at the shimmering prop discs. They sound ready. The bomber rolled onto the runway. Its shadow stretched across the tarmac like a giant waking from sleep. Tower, Silver Harvest requesting takeoff. Cleared for climb, Harvest. Good luck. Dawson eased the throttles forward. The engine screamed in harmony. The B-29 thundered down the runway. Faster, faster, lift. The wheels left the earth. Silver Harvest climbed into the sky. Engines roaring with the power of a factory compressed into 4 spinning monsters. Brackett and Morgan watched from the ground station. Headphones on, breathing shallow, eyes glued to the gauges. At 8,000 feet. Everything was smooth. At 12,000 feet. Still stable. At 16,000 feet. The first gusts of Pacific jet stream. Turbulence hit. Dawson's voice crackled through the radio. Winds rougher than expected. Engine tongue holding. Supercharger normal. Brackett nodded silently, but he knew altitude wasn't the real enemy. The enemy was cold. The kind of cold that didn't just freeze metal. It broke it. At 22,000 feet. The temperatures began dropping fast. Ice formed on the cowling edges. Air thinned. Exhaust. Note sharpened into a metallic howl. Morgan swallowed hard. Sir, if the airflow redesign fails, it won't, Brackett cut in. Morgan stared at him. You don't sound certain. Brackett whispered, because I'm not. At 24,500 feet. The first warning came, cylinder cluster 3. Temperature dropped too fast. A dangerous sign. Morgan stiffened. Sir, that's the expansion curve. Let it settle, Brackett said. But if it drops any faster, Morgan, Brackett said with force. Trust the redesign. The numbers stabilized. Barely. Morgan exhaled shakily. Sir, we're playing chess with the sky. Brackett didn't respond because the sky was winning. At 29,000 feet. Silver Harvest reached operational altitude. The bomber leveled off above the clouds. A tiny silver dot against a vast blue emptiness. Dawson's voice came through. Engines holding strong. All props steady. Running smooth. Brackett finally allowed himself a tiny nod. Then everything went wrong. The second warning light flashed. SUPRCHARGER load spike. Turbine airflow imbalance. Morgan's eyes widened. We've seen this pattern before in a ring. No, Brackett whispered. That's not the engine. He leaned closer to the data. That's the air. Morgan frowned. What? Brackett's voice dropped. They've flown straight into a high-altitude shear. Wave. Before Morgan could respond, slamma. Blast of invisible turbulence smashed the bomber sideways. Dawson cursed through the radio. Harvest. To ground, violent crossflow holding steady, engines compensating. The gauges exploded with numbers. Temperatures rising. Load spiking. Pressure hammering the system. Morgan gripped the console. Sir, the airflow intake is choking. No, Brackett said sharply. It's fighting. He clenched his jaw. Come on. Breathe. Breathe. The engine roared louder, RPM fluctuating, and then stabilized. Morgan whispered, It survived that? Brackett nodded slowly. Not survived. Adapted. But the Pacific wasn't done testing them. An hour into the endurance run, Dawson's voice came through again, this time softer, uncertain. Ground. We're hearing something. Brackett tensed. What kind of something? A sound I haven't heard before. Not vibration. Not detonation. Something else. Morgan looked at Brackett. Sir? Brackett held his breath. Describe it. Dawson hesitated. It sounds like a heartbeat. The room went silent. Morgan's face drained. Sir? Engines don't. Brackett didn't blink. They do if they're alive. Silver Harvest turned toward home. Altitude steady. Engines hot. Power stable, but the strange rhythmic sound continued. Not dangerous. Not failing. Just pulsing. Like the metal was telling them, I'm still here. When the bomber finally landed, the ground crew swarmed it, expecting cracks, burst seals, fractures. They found none. Not a single flaw, not one. Morgan stared at the data printout. Sir, this is the cleanest run we've ever seen. Brackett touched the warm engine casing. No, he whispered. This was its first fight. The real test comes next, Morgan frowned. What test? Brackett looked toward the Pacific horizon, the one where the enemy shoots back. Because now, the engines weren't fighting sky. Next, they'd be fighting war. The war didn't send a warning. It didn't send a report. Or a briefing. Or a tidy little message about deployment schedules. It sent a single telegram. Delivered at 2:17 a.m. straight to the Wichita command office. Morgan burst into the hangar, waving the paper with shaking hands. Sir Brackett, wake up. You need to read this. Brackett blinked himself awake from the cot he had been sleeping on. What is it now? Another redesign? Another field failure? It's worse, Morgan said quietly. Brackett grabbed the paper. 8 words, just 8. Engines. Needed for emergency Pacific strike tonight. Read it again. Then again. Morgan swallowed. There. Calling up the first squadron. Brackett felt his throat tighten. How many planes? 12. How many engines ready? 9. Brackett closed his eyes. That's not enough. Morgan nodded. I know. The next 6 hours were absolute chaos. The foundry roared like a volcano. Machinists carved metal like their lives depended on it. Welders worked without blinking. Mechanics poured oil and fuel and sweat into machines that were almost ready but not quite. Engine. Number Y number 31 #32 all incomplete. All missing parts. All missing tests. But Washington didn't care. The war didn't care. Brackett stormed onto the assembly floor. We need 3 engines ready. Now, no shortcuts. No compromises. No excuses. One mechanic stepped forward. Sir, you're asking for a miracle. Brackett grabbed his collar. No, I'm asking for everything you have. Miracles come after. The storm hit at dawn. Not a weather storm. A war storm. A squadron of B-29s landed at Wichita, their wings marked, their fuselages scarred. Their crews exhausted from months of flying through hell. Dawson stepped out of cockpit. #3 and jogged toward Brackett. You're late, Dawson said. Brackett stared at him. You weren't supposed to be here. None of us were supposed to live this long, Dawson replied. So, are the engines ready? Brackett said nothing, and that silence told Dawson everything. He stepped closer. Brackett, Men are dying out there. Planes are falling because the old radials can't handle the load. We need your engines, tonight. Brackett inhaled sharply. We're assembling them. Dawson looked him dead in the eye, then assemble faster. By 11:40 a.m., 3 new engines sat on the test stands, unpainted. Unpolished, still warm from casting. Morgan whispered, "Sir, we can't run full tests. There's no time." Brackett's jaw clenched. If we don't test them, we might lose an aircraft. If we do test them, we miss the strike window. Brackett felt something he hadn't felt in months. Fear, not fear of failure. Fear of choosing wrong. He ran a hand down the crankcase. "Engines aren't guesses," he murmured. "But war doesn't wait." Morgan looked at him. "Sir, you know better than anyone what they can handle." Brackett nodded slowly. "Run partial load. 10 minutes each. If they hold, they fly." Morgan hesitated. "That's not enough." Brackett whispered, "It has to be." 10 minutes later, engine number 33 roared. Held stable. Engine number 34 ran hot, too hot. Then settled. Barely. Engine number 35 shook violently. They nearly shut it down. Then the vibration disappeared. Brackett stared at the data. "Mount them," he said. Morgan blinked. "Sir, are you sure?" "No." Brackett stepped back. "But the war is." The B-29 crews prepped for takeoff. 12 aircraft. Dozens of pilots. Tons of ordnance. And 4 engines each, some old, some new, some untested. Brackett walked down the line of aircraft like a priest blessing soldiers before battle. Dawson leaned out of his cockpit. "You coming with us?" Brackett froze. "What?" "You built the Hearts," Dawson said. "Time to see them beat." Morgan's eyes widened. "Sir, no, you can't. I'm not flying," Dawson cut in. "You'll be in the engineer's bay, monitoring thermal loads. If something goes wrong, you'll know first." Morgan grabbed Brackett's sleeve. "Sir, this is suicide." Brackett looked at the engines. "At least if I die out there, it'll be with the machines I built." He stepped forward. "I'm going," Morgan whispered. "Then I'm going too." Brackett shook his head. "No, you stay. If we don't return, you finish what we started." Morgan looked stricken. "But sir," Brackett placed a hand on his shoulder, "this isn't about engines anymore. This is about the men they carry." He boarded the aircraft. The squadron rolled onto the runway. Engines thundered. Propellers blurred. Wings trembled under the weight of war. Brackett strapped himself into the engineer's station behind Dawson. "You sure you want to see what these things do at full combat power?" Dawson asked. Brackett tightened his harness. "Design them for this," Dawson smirked. "Then let's find out." He pushed the throttles forward. The engine screamed. Bomber surged forward, and the night mission began. B-29s climbed into the sky, one after another. Heading toward the Pacific horizon, clouds swallowed them. Darkness embraced them. War waited for them. Brackett watched the gauges climb: oil temp, cylinder temp, pressure, load. Everything held. Then at 19,000 feet, one gauge twitched. Just a twitch, barely a millimeter. But Brackett saw it, and his heart stopped. "Dawson," he whispered, "we have a problem." Dawson didn't look back. "Which engine?" Brackett stared at the flickering needle. "Number 3. Dawson tightened his grip on the controls. "Describe it." "It's not failing," Brackett said. "Then what is it doing?" Brackett swallowed. "It's starting to wake up."